In this video we'll look at questionnaire design. So let's start with what a questionnaire is. It's a prepared set of questions, or measures if you like, used by respondents or interviewers to record answers. So it's just a set of questions on a particular topic of interest, the focus of the questionnaire, and it's completed by either the respondents, if it's self-completed, or by the interviewers. And the purpose is to collect data which will subsequently be analysed and turned into information. So the steps in questionnaire design, well, first of all we have the initial considerations of why do we need a questionnaire and what will the questionnaire be composed of. So it needs to clarify the issues to be investigated. It also needs to develop the research questions that are needed to investigate the issues. What questions need to be asked and how should the questions be prepared for the questionnaire. It should also identify the target population and the relevant sampling frame. The target population is the relevant population for the particular interview or questionnaire or whatever the format is. It's the relevant population that are going to be interviewed or going to complete the questionnaire. And once the target population has been identified, let's say the target population was the student body, the total number of students in the country, or perhaps the total number of male students at a particular university. That could be the target population. Once it's been identified, then a relevant sampling frame must be derived. How is that population sampled? What's the process of sampling it? And that looks into areas such as sampling, which is the focus of several other videos. Work out the sampling approach, the sample size, and the expected response rate. How many should be selected within the sample, and how should the sample be selected in the first place? All of this, these are topics that are dealt with in other videos, but nonetheless, in the context of what we're doing here, it's relevant to specify these points here. And also decide on the method of data collection. Should it be face-to-face? Should it be by post? Should it be in groups or individuals? How should the sample be selected? So that is step one, the initial considerations. Step two is to clarify the issues to be investigated. The purpose of the exercise should be clearly defined. It should be clearly understood. And select the variables or the indicators to represent the concepts. In other words, make sure that the questions are relevant. Make sure the questions address the topics that are needed, the information that's required. So make sure that the questions focus in on what is required. The questions are not arbitrary or irrelevant. Not only will that upset the respondent, who will feel that time has been wasted, but it will waste resources as well. It doesn't do anything. So make sure that the questions are relevant. And examine or determine the level of measurement. What sort of detail is required? Is it in-depth or is it superficial? Just some indication, is that all that's required, or is it something deeper? So that's step two, clarify the issues to be investigated. Now step three, determine question types, formats and sequence. Determine the type of questions to include and their sequence and order. So what types of questions? Should they be open-ended? Should they be closed questions? If they're attitudinal, how many points on the scale? If it's a Likert scale, how many points? And how should the questions be sequenced? Which should come after which, and which depends on which, and There might be areas where you have to jump from question 2 to question 5. Let's say if the answer to question 2 meant that the following questions were irrelevant, so there might be jumps in the sequence. So that all needs to be worked out. A good way of doing this, as has been emphasized in other videos, is to conduct a pilot study. Check the wording and coding of the questions. The wording of the questions is very important. That may lead to all sorts of bias. Leading questions are wrong. They're dangerous, and they destroy almost the integrity of the whole process, because the interviewer, or the person completing the questionnaire, the person is leading perhaps the respondent to answer in certain ways. Well, that's so biased. That is biased, and it ruins the whole exercise. Decide on the groupings of the questions and the overall length of the questionnaire. A very long questionnaire may lead to frustration on the part of the respondent, who may get bored or feel it's a waste of time or it's taking too long. And determine how the questions should be grouped. And overall, look at the structure and the layout of the questionnaire. Make sure it's logical. Make sure it makes sense. The respondent will see or understand the logic as well. And if the questions are jumping around and not connected, it may seem like it's a very haphazard exercise, and the respondent may get bored again and not cooperate. So make sure that the whole exercise is logical. So these are ideas about the question types and the format and the sequence. Now next we should look at the pretest and questionnaire. Well, determine the most appropriate form of pretest for the questionnaire. Normally the pretest is very similar to the full questionnaire, except it's in miniature format. Instead of looking for a sample of, let's say, 50, a pretest might have a sample of 5 or 6. It's just to see if there are any issues that need to be fixed before the full sample is engaged. Analyze the initial data to identify limitations of the preliminary questionnaire. So once the pretest has been run, needless to say, it has to be analyzed to see what are the pitfalls and what are the issues that have been thrown up from the exercise and which can be fixed before the full sample is implemented. And of course, next, of course, to refine the questionnaire in light of the experience from the pretest. Revisit some or all of the steps above if necessary. In other words, go across everything again. Perhaps have a second retest if that's what's required. It's far better and cheaper to do that than to waste the resources on a full sample which has got errors in its makeup. So that's the pretest and questionnaire. Now let's move to the administering the questionnaire. Well, identify the best practice for administering the type of questionnaire utilized. Books and articles have many case studies and chapters on best practice. Make sure that the person administering or responsible for administering the questionnaire is familiar with that literature and can work out what is best practice, what is considered to be best practice, and attempts to implement the questionnaire in light of that best practice. All the field workers have to be trained, and have to be trained completely in the use of the questionnaire and in the required methods, which again reflects on best practice. And it'll also benefit from any pretest experience that they may gain, and that will feed into the way they approach the final questionnaire. Ensure a process is in place to handle completed questionnaires. It'd be rather silly if the whole exercise was conducted and then no one knew what to do with the questionnaires. So there must be follow-up. There must be a way of processing the questionnaires and doing it efficiently and turning the data collected into useful information. Now, some questionnaires may be self-completed, and in the event of self-completed interviews or interview-assisted questionnaires, it's important to take into account the respondent's educational background. You may be asking the respondent to complete a form that may be too challenging because perhaps the person's educational background is not sufficient, or perhaps the language used, the vocabulary used is too technical, or it's considered to be obscure by the respondent who is not familiar with that language, not familiar with the words perhaps. You also have to take into account any prior experience in completing questionnaires. This may be both positive and negative. Somebody who has completed previous questionnaires may have had bad experiences, and that may jaundice the way they look at the present exercise. On the other hand, some people may enjoy filling out questionnaires and may revel in the opportunity to complete yet another one. You also have to look at the age of the person completing it. Some people don't have time or can't be bothered or whatever. It may be a function of age. There may also be cultural issues. For example, some of the questions or some of the topics associated with the questionnaire may not be acceptable to some parts of the population. So cultural sensitivity is important as well. Now let's look at step 5, administer the questionnaire. Well, identify the best practice for administering the type of questionnaire utilized. Well, we've already talked about identifying the best practice. Train the field workers if required, and ensure a process is in place to handle the completed questionnaires. And determine the deadline and follow-up methods. So there we have a list of key points that are necessary to ensure that the whole exercise is useful, worthwhile, and will be fairly accurate and will do the job that's required of it. Now, two types of questions. First of all, we have open-ended questions. That's respondents are free to answer in their own words. And then we have closed-ended questions, where the respondents are required to select answers from a predetermined set of answers. Let's have a look at each of these in turn, just briefly. Start with open-ended questions, typically used in exploratory or qualitative studies. Quantitative studies tend to be closed, but qualitative, where you're looking for attitudes and looking for opinions and looking for a freer form of expression, these tend to be open-ended, and they tend to be mostly exploratory, exploring some issue with the respondent. And they're typically used in personal interview surveys involving small samples. Tend to be small samples because each questionnaire can take a considerable amount of time to complete, which means resources are being eaten away very rapidly. So open-ended questions tend to be small samples. The freedom of response, of course, may be something that the respondent enjoys. There's a freedom of response. It's a much freer atmosphere. The respondent is asked for an opinion and gives an opinion about the issue in his or her own words. It does require that the respondent is articulate and willing to spend time giving a full answer. So the whole exercise depends on the respondent's being able to articulate his or her feelings or thoughts on a particular topic, and also giving the time to do so. There may be busy people who are not prepared to give the time to answer the questions. So the data is in narrative form, which can be time-consuming and difficult to code and analyze. So it's in narrative form, so it's difficult to code up. Each answer may be slightly different from the previous one, so it's difficult to code it and difficult to analyze it. And the people who will process the questionnaires have to have very high skill levels in dealing with this type of response in order to make sense of the overall exercise. There is the possibility of researcher bias in interpretation. When the work is being interpreted, the people doing the interpretation may insert their own opinions or their own interpretation of what was being said, which may not truly reflect what was meant. So there is the opportunity for bias. The questionnaire analysis section of the exercise may introduce bias. Simply the people doing the analysis interpret what was said, perhaps wrongly. Narrative can be analyzed using content analysis, and there is software to do it, but it's early days for that, and perhaps over the next so many years, with the advances in computer technology, a more standardized approach to this type of work may be introduced, because computers are capable of understanding what was meant. With closed questions, well, closed questions, did you eat breakfast today? Yes or no? Simple. That's a closed question. The questionnaire does not require the respondent to describe anything, just give a yes or a no. Do you believe that in general companies maximize profits? Yes, no, or don't know. Straightforward. Tick one of the boxes. So it's a closed-end question. And should the government use tax revenue to support the arts? Yes, no, or don't know. With closed questions, typically used in quantitative studies, where some sort of quantitative analysis is to be performed. How many people said no? What proportion of the population don't believe the government is interested in the arts? What proportion of the population believes that the government is doing a good job? And so on. It's what proportion. It's mathematics. So it's quantitative. The researcher must be capable of pre-specifying the response categories. So the response categories must be worked out in advance, and the questions must be designed within each category. So there is a design issue. Closed questions require a lot of thought by the questionnaire designers. It takes time, it must be pre-tested, it must be pilot tested, perhaps pilot tested several times before the final product is ready for use. Data can be pre-coded so that statistical packages may be used for the analysis. Well, if it's a yes and no, then yes could equal 1, no could equal 0. So it's amenable to computer analysis. And there are packages, sophisticated statistical packages, which can do this. For example, the one I mentioned here is SPSS, which is the statistical package for the social sciences. A very sophisticated package, but it can use, using coding, it's possible to do the analysis. More difficult to design, but it simplifies the analysis. As I was saying earlier, closed question interviews or questionnaires, closed question ones, the questions have to be worked out very precisely in advance. And that means the development of the questionnaire or the set of questions is complex. It takes time, it takes resources, and it has to be carefully thought out. But the analysis of the questionnaire is quite straightforward because it is closed question. Used in studies normally involving larger samples, because once the questionnaire has been designed and because the processing time in terms of analysis is so fast, or it can be so fast, then larger samples could be gathered, larger samples could be used. And that means that it's often seen as the more preferred way of collecting information, or collecting data I should say, which will be turned into information. There is a limited range of responses. Did you have breakfast, yes or no? Well, the answer is no. However, I did have one biscuit, but that's not equal to breakfast. So you can see there's an ambiguity, there's a grey area in many of the responses. So there's a limited range of responses here. You're forcing people to say yes or no, when in fact there might be something small in between, which this exercise misses. Question of some broad considerations. Well, look at the sequence of the questions. That's very important. Make sure the sequence is logical. And the number of questions required to address each concept. Make sure that each concept, that is the focus of the whole exercise, each concept is addressed by a number of questions. And they are specific, well worded, clear, unambiguous, can be analyzed. In other words, that the exercise is not going to be a waste of time. Look out for question wording. Make sure that the questions are not leading or introduce bias, as I said earlier. Make sure that the question wording is as neutral as possible. And make sure that the field workers are trained not to use body language to influence the responses also. Not just the wording of the question, but if field workers are used, make sure that they do not use body language to influence the answers. Look at the overall length of the questionnaire to make sure it's not too long, because people get bored, or people have got work to do, or people are busy and they don't spend a long time answering a questionnaire. The way in which sensitive questions are dealt with. This is important. The way in which sensitive questions are dealt with is an issue. It depends on the nature of the study, but if it's into some area of, let's say, social policy involving family relationships, or the treatment of children, or health issues, or whatever, the questions have to be sensitive. The language used has to be sensitive, and it must not represent an exercise to intimidate the respondent or to upset the respondent. So the questions must be sensitive. The ability of respondents to understand and answer the questions is also an issue. Again, I mentioned this earlier, but sometimes the respondent may not have a very high level of educational achievement, and the questionnaire may pose an issue for the respondent. It may also be an embarrassment. The respondent may become embarrassed by the fact that he or she finds the questions difficult, questions that perhaps superficially look very straightforward. And the language used may also intimidate, so that's a problem, and that's something that has to be tried to be worked out, mostly in the pilot exercises, the pilot study areas. But it goes with the sensitivity questions, the sensitivity of the questions, I should say. It should go with looking at the language, looking at alternative words, and keeping the language as straightforward and as simple as possible, and avoiding technical languages or slang terms or areas that people may find difficult to understand. And the big issue is to decide between open-ended and closed-ended questions. Looking at the questionnaire, which is most appropriate? Well, it depends critically on what the questionnaire is attempting to achieve, but that has to be decided before all the rest of the areas are looked at. It's important, however, to avoid double-barreled questions. This is a matter of interest in passing. I mentioned the importance of language earlier, understanding the questions. So it's important to avoid double-barreled questions. They can lead to confusion. To what extent do you agree or disagree with the following statements? To what extent do you agree or disagree? I'm not too sure if I should be agreeing or disagreeing. I'm not too sure what the answer is, what the answer required is. I'm not too sure what I'm answering here. Am I agreeing or disagreeing? Because it's a compound. But having said that, to what extent do you agree or disagree with the following questions? Let's look at one of the questions. Let's say, BBC television is informative and entertainment. Now, do I agree with that? Well, you see, I could agree that it's very informative, but it's not very entertaining. Or I could agree it's very entertaining, but not informative. But is it informative and entertaining? Now, because it's a double-barreled, it's asking two questions. It's is the BBC informative? Question 1. Question 2, is BBC television entertaining? Question 2. So, but having both of them in one question, that makes it difficult to answer. And it's all caused by the word and. Football is a global sport and requires considerable skill to play. See, two questions again, caught up in one statement. Football is a global sport. Do you agree or disagree? Football requires considerable skills to play. Do you agree or disagree? Two questions, but put forward as one question. So it's very difficult to answer. And the problem again is and. Now, preparing and presenting questions. Well, first of all, as I said many times, use simple words. Be brief. Don't beat about the proverbial bush. Don't go everywhere. Just be as brief, as laconic as possible. Avoid any ambiguous terms. Anything which could be misunderstood, try to avoid those. And in the pre-test, that should be thrown up. That should be highlighted in the pre-test, so it should not get into the final test. Words or statements which are ambiguous should have been sorted out in the pre-test stage. But avoid ambiguous terms. And avoid leading questions. Questions of the ilk, don't you agree that the government is doing a really good job? That's leading the respondent. I have put words in the respondent's mouth. I have led the respondent. Don't you agree? It sounds like I'm being friendly and I'm being pro-government. Don't you agree? It's doing an excellent job. So try to avoid leading questions. Ask the question as neutrally as possible. A neutral question will give good results. And avoid double-barreled questions, as we've just seen earlier. Be careful about question order and context effects as well. Be careful that the questions are logical. One must follow from the next, and the respondent must see that. If the respondent sees it, the respondent will be happy. And make sure the context of the questions is also understood. Make sure that the person knows that the question is related to a particular area and they're clear about what is meant by the question. Check the layout and make sure that the layout is logical, the sequence is logical, the wording is logical, and any jumps in the questionnaire are also logical. If the answer to question 4 is yes, then go to question 7. So the questions in between are irrelevant. So make sure the jumps are logical as well. And make sure that the field workers have clear instructions, as do the people doing the analysis. It's most important that the people doing the analysis are properly briefed in the case of open-ended questions where there is some latitude for interpretation on their part. So it's very important that the people doing the interpretation for open-ended questions are properly trained and try to be as dispassionate or as logical, if you like, as possible when looking at the responses. And do not use their own interpretation, because that will influence the results and create a bias. Now, this has been a fairly long tour de force into issues in designing questionnaires. A lot of the material is very important in the design of questionnaires and should be taken into account. If you find it a little bit too daunting, go back over it, stop the video from time to time, make your own notes and do some research into the area. But in the meantime, that's all I want to say for the moment, so thank you for watching.